Two New Testament authors quote the exact same Old Testament verse, word for word. One concludes, Abraham was justified by faith, not by works. The other concludes, a person is justified by works, not by faith alone. Same verse, opposite conclusions. Is this a flat-out contradiction in the Bible, or is something more subtle happening? The answer hinges on two words that sound identical but may mean completely different things: faith and works. To understand how Paul and James reached opposite conclusions, we need to start with the verse they share. Genesis 15:6, Abraham has no son, he is old, his wife is barren, and God makes an extraordinary promise. Your descendants will be as numerous as the stars. Abraham looks up at the night sky and believes. The text says this belief was reckoned to him as righteousness. Justification, being declared in right standing with God, came through Abraham's trust in that promise. This single verse becomes the foundation for two radically different arguments. Paul quotes it in Romans and Galatians. James quotes it in his letter. Both treat it as authoritative. Both build their theology on it. And they arrive at opposite conclusions. Paul writes to communities in Rome and Galatia torn apart by a specific debate. Must Gentile converts to Christianity also adopt Jewish law? Must they be circumcised, keep kosher, observe the Sabbath? Paul says no, and Genesis 15:6 is his proof. Look at the timeline, he argues. Abraham was declared righteous in Genesis 15. Circumcision doesn't appear until Genesis 17. Abraham was justified before the commandment even existed. Righteousness came through trust in God, not through legal observance. This is critical. When Paul says works, he means works of the Torah, the specific practices that marked Jewish identity: circumcision, dietary laws, Sabbath keeping. And when Paul says faith, he means something deep and existential, like not just believing that God exists, but committing your entire life to God through Christ. A trust so complete it reorients everything. James writes to a very different community facing a very different crisis. His audience is poor. Yes, wealthy people sit in places of honor in their assemblies while the destitute go hungry. James poses a devastating test case. If a brother or sister is naked and lacks daily food, and you say, "Go in peace, be warmed and filled, but do nothing," what good is that? Then James invokes Abraham too, but he points to a different moment, Genesis 22, where Abraham offers Isaac on the altar. Faith was active along with his works, James writes, and faith was completed by works. His second example is Rahab the prostitute, a non-Israelite woman who risked her life to shelter Israelite spies, not ritual observance, concrete, dangerous, costly action. James's verdict is blunt: faith without works is dead, and his works mean feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, sheltering the vulnerable. On the surface, this looks like a flat contradiction, but here's where it gets interesting. What if they're not even using these words to mean the same thing? Start with faith. James defines it explicitly. He writes, "You believe that God is one." Good. Even the demons believe and shudder. That verse, James 2:19, is the key that unlocks this entire debate. James is talking about propositional belief, believing that something is true, acknowledging a fact. The demons know God exists. They know God is one. That knowledge terrifies them, but it doesn't save them. Now ask, would Paul ever say the demons have faith? Never. For Paul, faith means trust, commitment, a leap into relationship with God through Christ. Demons cannot trust Christ. They cannot commit their lives to God. They can only acknowledge reality and tremble. Paul and James are using the same English word for fundamentally different concepts. Think of it this way. Saying I believe this chair exists is propositional belief. You acknowledge a fact. Saying I believe in you is something else entirely. Trust, loyalty, a relationship, same word, belief. vastly different meanings. James attacks the first kind. Paul champions the second. They're not contradicting each other. They're talking about different things. The same mismatch applies to works. Paul's works are circumcision, dietary laws, Sabbath observance, the boundary markers of Jewish identity. He's arguing that Gentiles don't need to become Jewish to be part of God's people. James's works are feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, sheltering the vulnerable, like Rahab did. He's arguing that real faith produces concrete care for people in need. They aren't discussing the same category of human action. And there's a third layer. In the 16th century, Martin Luther took Paul's argument and expanded it far beyond its original scope. Luther redefined works to include indulgences, baptism, confession, penance, anything humans do to earn salvation. This was a powerful theological move that reshaped Christianity. But it went well beyond what Paul himself was arguing about. Paul opposed Jewish law as an entry requirement. Luther opposed the entire medieval sacramental system. James's urgency makes more sense once you see his community. When the rich exploit the poor and then claim I have faith as a shield against accountability, a faith alone theology becomes morally dangerous. James needed a theology that demanded action, not as a way to earn salvation, but as proof that faith is real. He's not proposing a works-based salvation system. He's defining what genuine faith looks like when it hits the ground. So where does this leave us? Are Paul and James allies, opponents, or something in between? The honest answer, it's genuinely ambiguous. In one sense, they're talking past each other, using the same words with different definitions, addressing different audiences, facing different pastoral crises. Paul fights legalism, the idea that ritual observance earns God's favor. James fights complacency, the idea that belief without action is sufficient. And Paul himself was full of ethical exhortation. He told communities to care for one another, pursue love, live transformed lives. His not by works argument targeted Jewish law observance as a condition of entry into the covenant community, not a rejection of ethical living. Yet James clearly thinks he's opposing something that sounds a lot like Paul's teaching, whether Paul himself or a distorted version of it. This ambiguity is itself instructive. Even within the New Testament, there was no single monolithic theology. Early Christianity was a living debate. This tension shaped the Reformation. Luther famously called James an epistle of straw, a dismissive term suggesting it lacked the weight of Paul's theology. And that judgment continues to divide Protestant and Catholic thought to this day. Protestants tend to emphasize Paul, salvation through faith, grace as a gift. Catholics tend to emphasize James, faith must bear fruit in action or it's not faith at all. The Paul-James debate remains a live question for anyone who asks, what does it mean to have faith? Is it something you hold or something you do?